All right, scholars, I would like to spend this next lecture period talking to you about why you would want to study church history. So I've told you now at this point about all of the things that you need to do in this class to succeed, and that basically has only accomplished creating this sort of evil feeling in your tummy, in the sense of a lot of stress and things that you need to do, and I know what that's like. I actually get that same feeling getting ready to teach this class. So we're all in this together. But why would we do this? Why is it that, what's the value of studying church history, and why would you want to do this? And the question specifically that I want to ask and address with you is, why does why does church history belong in the theology curriculum? So I'm not going to ask this question from a very general point of view. What's the point of studying church history generally? That would give us too many possible responses. Well, church history is interesting, helps you understand society, provides great stories for preaching or whatever. No, let's focus this in a little bit. Why is church history part of formal theological study? So I think I know whom I'm speaking to. You're all theology students or Bible students. Many of you are planning on ministerial careers. Even if you're not, you're interested in ministry stuff. You're active in churches. Why would you be interested in church history is the question that I want to address. And I have 5 basic responses that I'll work through with you. The study of history does require a little justification, though. Why would anyone study history? Some of these standard answers that have been given to us might include, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. George Santayana is credited with that saying. I like to start off with that statement because it seems to me clear that those who think that history will keep us from repeating the mistakes of the past clearly haven't read their history. Right? Isn't that the first thing that you learn? And ironically, I know that Santayana knew that, but no, we don't study the past with the hope that somehow that's going to keep us from repeating the mistakes of the past, although that would be lovely. Voltaire says that history is a pack of tricks that we play on the dead. What could he possibly mean by that? History is a pack of tricks we play on the dead. It's kind of probably what Walter Benjamin meant when he said history is written by the victors. My favorite quotation about history is from Henry Ford. History is bunk. I guess the original quotation was actually something, history is more or less bunk, tempers it a little bit. Why would anyone study history? What is the point of history? And today we begin, I'm assuming, you all begin from a standpoint of suspicion about history. History is a manipulation. History is a way of exercising power over dead people who can't speak up for themselves. Yeah, this is a trick we play on the dead, as Voltaire says. George Orwell cuts through this too and says that those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. History has become for us in this modern age something that we look through. What people will tell us is this hermeneutics of suspicion. We look to history through this lens of the, quote, hermeneutic of suspicion. Nietzsche taught our civilization how to do this. This is all about power. This is all about controlling a meta-narrative that will fashion society according to the way that the author of this history wants us to perceive society and interact with each other. We start from a place of suspicion about history. And I'm using all kinds of shorthand now just to see if I can get you all on the same page. I haven't explained those viewpoints, but I think many of you think of them as representative. History requires a little explanation or justification. So let me approach this question of why would anyone study church history especially theology students, particularly theology students. If I could have control of the document camera, that would be super. Thank you so much. Let me offer a couple suggestions. Number one, a knowledge of church history is probably the best way to learn to recognize expressions of true Christianity. Now, that's not the only bullish claim that I'm going to make today. I'm going to be an apologist for church history here for the moment, so pardon me for getting excited about this. Why should you as a theology student study church history? I believe that this will be a primary tool for you to learn to recognize true expressions of Christianity in contexts that you're not familiar with. Why would anyone want to do that? You will want to do that constantly. In a graphic example, let's say that you're physically transplanted into a culture that you don't know. You go to the jungle on some sort of missionary enterprise, or you cross cultures, you go to on some sort of cross-cultural mission for missionary work, and you start to worship with a church that you have no formal you had no previous connection with this community, and they're practicing many different things differently than you do. I believe church history will be your best resource to figure out how to interpret this new community that you're looking at. Church history, here's what's going on. What is it that history does? History is effectively an exercise of reflecting on the character of something. That's what history is. When we write a history about something, you're caught between two forces. You're caught between these forces of discontinuity and continuity. And you as the historian, or the student of history, I include us all in that, we as students of history are caught trying to interpret this subject between this flow of discontinuity and continuity. And the result is, it's a very powerful way to examine something's nature, okay? What do I mean by this? Caught between the forces of discontinuity and continuity. First of all, a history is through time, and things change all the time through time. So if we're doing a history, let's just take something very generic, of a colonial America, then you're studying a subject through this swath of a couple hundred years where all kinds of changes are taking place in European politics and in relations with Native American peoples, and technological advances are taking place, and crops are failing here and there, and so on. All kinds of changes are taking place, but you as the historian, even in the way that you have framed the study, colonial America from 1620 to 1776, the way that you framed that study tells me that you believe it's the same subject that's marching through that changing time period. Everything else can change, but you believe that colonial America deserves to be thought of as one subject. There's a continuity there too, isn't there? And that's what the historian is doing. You're tracing, although everything else around it is changing, this subject is somehow staying the same. It changes too, but your claim as a historian is that you're talking about one subject. Otherwise, you'd write a couple of histories about it. Colonial America from 1620 up to whatever, 1680, and your next subject begins there if you thought that there was some sort of break in the subject. What is it that we're doing with church history? We're studying the church, and the claim is that this thing that we call the church, this phenomenon, this mystery that we call the church, is the same as it was 2,000 years ago. Have you ever stopped to think about the enormity, or the magnificence, I should say, something like that, the magnitude of the size of the study that we're embarking on? We're talking about a study that's of church history. If we're trying to do all of church history, we're talking about something that's almost 2,000 years. We're talking about a body that today is about 2.3 billion people. What other story in world history has those kind of proportions? It's through every country of the world. What other story could you tell that would be that huge? 2.3 billion people. That's going to be one of the largest demographic indicators in the world. No country's that large. The only thing larger than that would be gender. That's about the only demographic larger than 2.3 billion people. Maybe you can think of one or two others, but this is going to be up on the top list. We're talking about an enormous story that we're trying to tell. And the claim, the way that we framed the study, is that we're starting with the conviction that it makes sense to talk about the church 2,000 years ago as essentially the same today. That means that this is going to be a huge 2-semester study on what is the nature of the church. Now, I happen to believe that we've correctly framed the study, that church history is a possible endeavor, that studying church history 2,000 years ago does make sense. I have that conviction. But the whole class, in a sense, will be an apologetic for that claim, that it makes sense, that there is a continuity there, that this church, it makes sense to speak of church history. It's a study of the church, and by becoming intimate with this sense of what the church looks like through different ages, you're learning to recognize expressions of Christianity. And as you meet them today in people that in new relationships that you forge, hi, my name's Jonathan, and you introduce yourself to someone else, and they're from a church tradition that you've never heard of, and they do things perhaps that you've not experienced before. This is going to be your best tool to understand what is the possibility, what's the extent of the possibility of what a true church would look like from what I know of the church. This is going to be a great reason to study church history. Church history, now what is the church? I'll tip my hand a little bit to you. What is the church? The church, as biblically defined, is a mystery. And part of that will not be able to escape. The Christian teaching of what the church is from the Scriptures, from the New Testament Scriptures, is that it is the body of Christ. Paul the Apostle comes about the closest to defining what the church is in Ephesians, but he speaks of it as a mystery. He doesn't give it a legal definition or a cultural definition or a mathematical definition or anything of the sort, precisely because it defies all of those categories. It's not going to fit into a single cultural template or a single historical framework. It's not going to fit. Paul appeals to it with these metaphors. It's the house of God. We're living stones built in this house. We're the family of God. We're the body of Christ. We're the bride of Christ. All these images get at aspects, but they're purposefully communicating this mystery. The church is a mystery. What is this mystery? As best I know, and as where I stand in my own journey of studying church history, the mystery of the church is God's action of uniting humanity, although from different cultures and tongues and languages and everything else. The mystery of the church is God stitching humanity together from all of these different, with all of these differences and all of these differences that we come to. The church is a supernatural work of God bringing us together into some sort of oneness, some sort of reality whereby it's right to speak of us as a single body. Church history then does become complicated because in some way we're looking at an act of God. So that keeps us on our toes. How do you recognize an act of God? There's going to be no easy answers to that. That's part of the struggle of going through church history and working through these things. That's question one, or that's reason one why I think church history belongs in the theology curriculum. Reason number two would run something like this. Church history helps us to come to a place of generosity towards other Christians. And this is just true. This is a simple point, but it's real and practical. Remember that roommate that you had last year that you thought was a little bit nutty or a little bit tipsy or whatever? Just, where is this person from? Yep, I'm getting a lot of feedback. You all had one of those roommates. And then you sat down and had coffee or had a first extended real conversation. And what was it that happened in that conversation that opened you up to one another whereby you had a sense of sympathy and understanding for who they are as a person? They told you some of their history. That's what happened. You sat down over coffee and they told you things like what their family life was like when they were growing up, or what part of the country they're from, or how they came to Moody, or XXX. They start telling you all these things about their history. By the way, have you noticed the way as we as people start conducting conversations is usually on a historical basis? Those are some of the first questions we launch into one another when we're trying to understand where this person is coming from. We start asking them about their history. Where are you from? That's interesting. How many siblings did you have in your family? Etc. Those are some of the first questions that we start trying to figure out. What do you like? And what I mean by that is, what's your favorite activity? What have you been doing a lot of? We ask these historical questions to understand the person and where they're coming from. And this can be transferred not to just on an individual basis, but to other Christian traditions too. We start understanding why churches as groups are worshiping in a certain way, with liturgy or with are you happy clappy? Are you from a church that's happy clappy? Or are you from a church that's all bells and smells, right? You start to understand why people worship the way they do. And you start to get into their logic and see things from their perspective, and then things start to open up. So it does bring us to a place of generosity towards other Christians, and that's just a good thing. Also, point number 3, it helps us settle into our theological identity and to come to a place of fruitfulness in ministry. Do you remember what the Apostle Paul says in those passages where he's talking about the gifts of the Spirit in Corinthians 12 through 14? I should have brought my Bible. I should be reading this to you, but I forgot to make sure that I had my Bible with me today. Paul there tells us things like, the body of Christ shouldn't imagine that every part is a hand or a foot. We're not all the same part. We have different gifts, different things that we bring to the body, right? And we tend to read that passage of Paul as referring to individuals. And I think Paul probably did mean it about individuals when he was writing this. We as individual church members bring something unique to the mix of God's gifting of our church. But it's also true of the body of Christ worldwide. Different parts of the body do things better than other parts. I remember experiencing this for the first time after I had, as I was leaving Fordham University, and I had studied there with the Jesuits for a few years during my PhD program. And I remember thinking, I as an evangelical have a burden for a specific type of ministry. We have radio stations. Moody has radio stations, and that's great. That's a wonderful expression of God's ministry in the world. It reaches a certain type of person, but it doesn't reach everybody, nor should we think that it does, right? Some of you are gifted in evangelism in a way that some of you aren't. And some of you can talk to people in a way that's free-flowing and natural, and you can get to speaking about spiritual things in a way that might be difficult for some of the rest of us. Guess what? Some whole traditions of Christianity are more evangelistic than other traditions. Some are more reflective. Some are more active they build hospitals. Some of us do other things. There's actually, the individual gifting that Paul speaks about in Corinthians 12 through 14 can be applied beyond individuals to actual whole traditions of Christianity. And that's something that we'll see as we study Christian history. It will also help you figure out how to be useful in this huge body of Christ. What is it that you do well? You were raised in a particular Christian tradition, or you converted into a particular Christian tradition. And there's something very powerful about that. In a way, it's very hard for us to grow out of the tradition in which we found God. I was speaking to a man about this a few months ago, and realized that in my own life too, that's true. It's very hard for us to grow beyond or to change the way that we conceive of ministry and church work. It's very difficult for us to grow beyond the place that we first found God. I almost think that it's like we as ministers are trying to reproduce the ministry that we've experienced. Was your youth pastor a huge influence on you? Maybe you want to be a youth minister. etc., etc. The way that you experience finding God is usually the way we try to communicate God's presence to others as well. And whole Christian traditions do this. It's not just an individual basis. If you are able, through the study of church history, if this class helps you find where in the broader body of Christ you belong, it'll help you do what you do best. That's my hope. Good. I've got two more swell reasons why you need to study church history. Good. A knowledge of church history is necessary to be an effective leader in the Christian movement. Okay. I don't know what your leadership philosophy is, but I once had the privilege of meeting the man who used to run Jaguar. And he was a German man. He was explaining to me that, or a relative of his was explaining to me that he ran Jaguar during his early days, and then he went on to this huge European conglomerate of 18,000 employees. And I got the pleasure of having dinner with him once. And he was telling me about his leadership style. Here was a man who oversaw 18,000 employees. His leadership style, which I've been very attracted to ever since, is that the leader's job is to throw him or herself into a place of crisis. Where in the organization are structures and people failing? Okay? You look at this huge body of thousands of people. Where in the whole organization is there failure? That's where the leader takes his team, jumps in feet first, starts stomping out fires, reproduces order, and then gets out and jumps to the next fire. Now, whatever your leadership philosophy is, how are you going to be an effective leader in the church if you don't know the history of this body, where it's come from? As a leader, you're going to be forced to constantly be repairing things. You're going to be put in places of failure and repairing structures that failed. You're going to have to exercise creativity. This didn't work in the past, so we're going to have to do something else here in this place of failure. But I want to do it in a way that's faithful to Christian identity, to Christian orthodoxy. You're going to have to be creative as a leader. How are you going to have that creative sense in a way that's faithful to the Christian body so that the whole thing doesn't fall off the rails and your church experiences mutiny? How are you going to exercise that without understanding at a very deep level what the nature of this church is? You're going to have to know church history in order to be an effective Christian leader. Now, this is the way that you would have to know Christian history in order to be an effective leader will, of course, vary greatly by your circumstances. If you're in a Christian tradition that has nothing to do with John Wesley, then maybe knowing your elder board at a deep level, knowing their personal history, would be a more effective way to lead that particular congregation than reading some homilies by John Wesley. But you get my point. Particular to its context, faithful leadership is going to require a knowledge of the history of the church. And lastly, my least defensible point, but perhaps most alluring. I've saved here to the end, the study of church history is a tried and true method to reflect on the character of God. I have to be careful here because I don't want you to think that I could be paraphrased as saying, you have to learn this class to be saved. You have to excel in this class to be saved. That's not what I'm saying. But here's where I'm caught. Technically, the study of anything could be a study of the character of God, right? Couldn't I study biology at a deep level and learn something of God's creative power? Couldn't I study astronomy or geology or logic or any other formal discipline? Technically, any discipline could be an exercise in reflecting on the character of God, right? So church history is not unique in that regard. And I don't want to oversell church history as something that it's not. But church history is a standard way that in traditional theological curricula, people have reflected on the nature of God, right? God is somehow an actor in this story in a mysterious way that will be hard to pinpoint all throughout. But somehow, we as Christians do share the belief that God is leading this body, that God is somehow making something of this story. Have you ever stopped to think about how much of the Scripture is communicated to us in the form of history? God has a thing for history. Again, I want to be careful here, but there is a serious point I'm trying to make. Reflect with me, how much of the Scripture, God's revelation to humanity, is set in a historical context? About half of it is larger than any other single genre of the Scripture in our Old and New Testaments, right? You've got Genesis, you've got Exodus, you've got most or some of Numbers and Deuteronomy, got Joshua, Judges, Ruth. These are all historical books. Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, some of Job, right? The Gospels. You've got snippets in the prophets, Daniel, and a few other passages in Jeremiah and places that are history. You've got the Gospels, you've got Acts. Now, in those stories, in those large sections of the Bible that are communicated to us in history, does God speak? Is God an actor in those books? Sometimes he is directly, sometimes he's not. But we assume, even where God doesn't tell us where he fits in the story, that part of our discipline as reading those scriptures is to find God in the story, isn't it? Well, did God cease to exist or stop acting after Jesus ascended back to heaven? No. Where is God in the story now? Presumably, he's there. And this is part of the discipline of church history. Where can we find God in the narrative? So my last reason there is church history is I trust valuable to you as theological students, as it is a tried and true method to reflect on the character of God. God answers prayer. We'll see that if we look to church history. God doesn't abandon his church, although they do go through very difficult times. We'll see that. That tells us something about God. These are the lessons that I hope you're accumulating as we go through this. All right. Chase, how are we doing for questions up top? Do we have any questions that have come in? Super. Why don't we address those, and then if you have a quiz, we can take a quiz, and then we'll take a second break.
So one of the biggest questions that people are asking is kind of how, like what you mean by like the continuity within like where we fit in the church. So like more specifically, how does studying the history of theology relate to our personal theology and where we're at right now?
Good. Okay, great. Is there a way that you can reproduce the exact wording just for future reference? That would be swell. So what is this bit about how church history will help us find our place in the larger body? Is that the question that people are asking? Great. Well, it kind of maps for us the extent of Christianity. If you imagine church history is both geographically spread. From time to time, we'll be talking about different parts on earth of this history, and it's also spread over time, right? It's a story that extends over time and space. And you, as an individual Christian, are located in a particular access there in time and space. And that will affect dramatically the Christian tradition that you know and understand as your own. So I think of it as a map. Going through church history is like opening up a whole bunch of huge maps and looking over the table. And even if we're looking at places that we've never been, that will be very helpful to know how that set of influences came to construct our own tradition. We assume that our tradition is just normal until we start reading history, either our own history or any church history. And then we realize, oh, our tradition is a specimen of something much larger. And that's a very helpful thing for you to come to. Good. All right, scholars, it's 9:43. Let's get going. I would like to spend our last hour reflecting together on what will the historiography of this class be, and trying to share that with you, what my vision is for church history. I've told you what we're going to do in this class, and I've told you why I think we're going to do it. Now I'm going to try to address the how question. So how are we going to approach church history? Does anybody want to tell me what a historiography is? Anybody got an idea? I know one of you or more know it, so just tell me. Okay, I'll tell you. No, go ahead. Somebody got it? What's a historiography? Please. Great. Was it Ben? Cameron, sorry. So it's the study, not of history itself, but it's the study of historical writings. Thank you, Cameron. It's the study of how we put history together. or it's the study of the formal discipline of history. Okay? How do we construct histories? Now, I opened up last period with a couple quotes that I think you relate to, that history is bunk or a trick we play on the dead or something like that. I think you relate to the suspicion of that history can be manipulative, right? Any story we tell can be manipulative. Even stories that are largely true can be used for ends, particular ends in our social contexts. Why would that be any different than from the history that we do here as a class? Well, frankly, it's not. History is always telling towards a certain end. I agree with that presupposition. I don't think there's any such thing as a perfectly objective history either. I understand what you mean when you tell me that history has a slant. Sure it does. We focus on particular things. Even if all of the reporting is true, simply the way you structure the study reveals your interests. So I'm not opposed to that. I know that history has an angle. Sure, that's fine. So the best way that I think we can approach this, though, is to reflect a little bit on how historiography works, and for me to just be completely transparent with you. Here's what I think I'm doing. Here's the angle that I think I'm giving this historical narrative. I'll share that with you, and our time will be up. First of all, histories, let me just go through a couple examples here to show you that histories can be constructed in very different ways, and these are not perfectly serious examples, but they will get to the point. My favorite example of a history that has a slant to it is the wedding video history, okay? That particular genre of history, the wedding video. Now, summer's over, and you went to 18 weddings this summer, whatever. It was a lot, perhaps. Some of you went to a bunch of weddings, and you saw perhaps a number of these wedding videos. You know, that's the part of the ceremony, this informal part. It hasn't made it into many standard liturgy books yet, but it's the informal part of the wedding where everybody's eaten something and they're probably getting to feel pretty good and satisfied, and the lights are dimmed, and then on the power projector screen over to the side, some lovely music starts playing, and we start seeing images of the bride and groom as they went through their growing up years, okay? That's a form of a history, right? First we see little Jane as she's growing up, and here she's 3 months old. These are her first words, and so on and so on. And then we see Bobby do the same, and and they meet somehow, and it always ends up that they're on a beach kissing right before they got engaged, So anyway, that's where the story always ends up. That's a particular slant on that romantic history, right? I mean, is this the full truth, nothing but the truth? Is this how it actually happened? Well, this is a particular telling of that story that's appropriate for this particular context. But any story is told to a particular context, right? If I ask you the question, when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, how would you respond? Okay? How would you respond? I'll ask the question this way. In what year did Christopher Columbus discover the New World? 1942? Is that what I just heard? Wait a minute. Most of you know that Christopher Columbus, you know that I'm searching for 1492, but I think you're choking up on the fact, wait a minute, there are two things that you might take issue with here, discover and New World. Those are not neutral terms, right? So if I'm asking, when did Christopher Columbus sail and land in the Bahamas, from Spain to the Bahamas, you might tell me it was, for the first time, you might tell me it was 1492, but if I gave a lecture to you or gave a description of how Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, that clearly is from a particular angle and a particular with a particular end. Okay, so you see how this works. What I would like to do in this class is tell the story of church history to the best of my ability, looking with the angle, with the continual focus on world Christianity. I believe that we are in a period of time when we, as Christian ministers of the gospel, need to be aware of this phenomenon called world Christianity. And I will do my best through this course to tell the story of church history with this in the back of our minds. How did we get to the present moment? Now, this class is called Christianity and Western Culture. So it's appropriate that we examine how is it that Christianity came and nestled into Western culture, Europe and later North America, etc. How is it that that Christian teaching nestled into that cultural context and produced a particular form of Christianity that we continue to recognize here in the West? How did that happen? It would also be very appropriate for us to ask, so how did Christianity settle in parts of the non-West? There is some real justification for focusing on the West. I think we're in the West, first of all. We're north of California. Where do you think that puts us? So, yes, we are culturally located in the West here. It's appropriate for us to study that history from a Western perspective. Also, it's a way of limiting curriculum a little bit. If we had to study also at the same depth Australian church history and African church history and Asian church history to the same depth, we just never get through this material. That would massively amplify the amount of material that we would have to cover. But I will, as much as I'm able to, I will try to tell this story from a global perspective. Now, let me focus in on this with you for a moment. What is world Christianity? Many of you will be familiar with this terminology, but I'd like to flesh that out. I'd like to share with you what I'm thinking of when I think of world Christianity and where I'd like to take this particular class. What is world Christianity? Well, let me tell you a story first, and then I'll tell you some facts and figures too. But let me start this part by telling you a story of how I was introduced to world Christianity. And I had done some reading a little bit before this too, but this is how I came in contact with world Christianity. Okay, so I'm going to take you back to 2011. I had joined the faculty here at Moody Bible Institute, and during one summer, I had the opportunity to teach in Nigeria. I was going to teach a class on the African church fathers. So I'm an ancient church historian. I was going to be teaching on Augustine, Origen, and some of the Cyprian and some of these other church fathers who lived and breathed in African soil in antiquity. I was flying over to Nigeria, and here is what I saw as we were approaching Lagos. Here's what I saw as I was looking outside of the window as we were about to land in the city of Lagos, which I think then had about 15 million people. So it's one of the large cities of the world. What is it that you notice as we're approaching the city? Can you see that picture well enough to see? Clear streets. Good. Good. Any other observations? Maybe it is a little bit far back. I'm sorry if you can't see that very clearly. The observation that I noticed as we were looking at dirt roads, I thought this, from my culture, very strange. Here I'm approaching a city that's, I think in terms of raw population, larger than New York, but with dirt roads. I didn't quite know what to do with that. I snapped a picture as we were driving along the way out to the guest house where we were to stay, and we stopped over at the Ekwa guest house. This was just outside of the city of Lagos, and then we were going to head about 6 hours north into the country by car the next day, where we were going to be teaching at Igbaja. Ekwa is an abbreviation that once stood for Evangelical Church of West Africa, and perhaps you can see that on the little icon to the top left there of the sign. But my host told me that ECWA no longer stands for Evangelical Church of West Africa because the church no longer fits in West Africa. It's an international denomination. So they've changed that now to Evangelical Church Winning All. Here was my brilliant host, Moses Owajaya. Moses had done some really remarkable things already at this point in his career. He had written a master's thesis that had won or had been entered into a very prestigious contest. There was a editor board in Holland that was surveying master's theses and PhD theses, I think, from Africa, looking for top achieving students, and Moses Awajaya was not the very winner, but won, I think he was third place in this international contest. So he'd done some really brilliant research already at this point. As we had left the guest house the night before, he signaled to the driver, and he asked that the driver pull over, and Moses started pointing my attention to something that I was seeing on the horizon as we were going down the highway. Now, I don't remember exactly how fast we were going on the highway, but we were going maybe 50 miles an hour, something like that. And this object that Moses was pointing to just kind of stayed on the horizon along next to us. I didn't know what I was looking at. We approached it, and it was, I think, the largest building I've ever seen in my life. So here we are looking towards in the building. It's hard to get a sense of perspective, but do you see on the left-hand side and center, do you see those concrete blocks with the iron girders sticking out of them? Those are a short city block apart. So you're looking at a very large structure. Ultimately, it's about 32 city blocks long. I was looking up, I know it's ridiculous, but I was looking up, and I couldn't quite tell, but maybe 60 or 70 feet above my head, something like that, was this very simple tin or this girder structure, and then I'm not sure what those upper pieces are, but something to keep the rain off. A very, very basic structure to this auditorium area. I walked to the front and kind of in a state of dizziness was looking around at the sea of white chairs around me. I know it sounds like I'm describing a vision to you, doesn't it? Anyway, there's sea of white chairs around me that seemed endless to me. Here we are looking to the side of the building. Again, it's hard to get a sense of perspective, but that's many blocks away, the very edge of the building. This is looking back from the front of the auditorium, and it's very hard, again, to get that sense of perspective, but this picture helps a little bit. If you can see in the middle of the picture, there's something that looks like a small square. That's one of those large outdoor televisions that you might have for a sporting event or something like that. And then, so it's to relay a visual image of what's taking place at the stage, but at a distance of about 5 blocks removed. And then you can't tell at this resolution, but if you look very closely at the picture, you can see another screen 5 blocks further down. And actually, on my resolution, I can see a third screen off in the distance 5 blocks later, and then it just goes off into the distance. Okay, so we're looking at a very large space. If you step out to the side of the building, you can just see it wander off to the edge of the world, off into the horizon there. What was I looking at? What happened here? Well, my Nigerian pastor friend who wanted to show me this wanted to show me where this denomination meets. So it was the Redeemer Camp, which is where we were, and he was explaining to me that it's not a church building we were looking at, but it's a denominational meeting ground, like a campground. So once a month, Moses was explaining to me, the whole denomination gets together. There's about 15,000 churches in the city of Lagos of this particular denomination. And so that explains the 20,000 about plastic chairs at the front. Those are for the pastors. So when they meet once a month, that's where the pastors would sit. And then the congregants sit in that space of endless wooden benches that Moses was telling me there were reports that 10 million people could sit there. He didn't believe that. He thought it was probably closer to 1 to 3 million people. But this is a very, very large place. I ran Bloomsday 2 years ago. I try to get out there and run it once in a while. And that seems to me to be a huge crowd. There's about 50,000 people running that. So even on a conservative estimate of 1 million people, you're looking at something about 20 times that amount of people. Now, I didn't think of it at the time, but later came back on Google Maps and got a satellite image of this building that I had sort of crashed into and couldn't really, I'm not used to navigating buildings that large, so I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking at. But here, if you go down to the center there on the side, you can see that we're looking at a building that actually does measure about 1 kilometer long and about 2/3 of a kilometer wide. Now, a picture's worth 1,000 words. What just happened? What do you think about Nigeria? What do you assume to be true of the church in Nigeria? Okay, How do you relate to the church in that part of the world? Now, I have a confession to make. As far as I know, this is a truly unique space. It's not like every little African country is going to have one of these in their backyard, okay? No, this is a unique thing. This is, as far as I know, the largest worship space on earth. But did you expect it to be in Nigeria? I don't know. The world is changing really rapidly. Can I share a few facts that try to help flesh out this idea of world Christianity? What is it? And how did the church get to this place in the world today? Here's just a couple quick facts. And I dropped these from the Atlas of Global Christianity. Atlas of Global Christianity. It came out in 2009. Chase, do you think you could find an image of that and just put it up on the screen? That'd be sweet. Came out in 2009. It's a very important document for the study of world Christianity. In 1910, there was a very influential missionary conference in Edinburgh. This missionary conference we'll talk about in next semester. Some people say it was the beginning of the ecumenical movement. Some say it was a dramatic change in Protestant missions. But at any rate, most representatives of most Protestant denominations gathered in Edinburgh in 1910 and sort of did a state of Christian missions around the world conference and produced a lot of facts and figures that really gave us unprecedented amounts of data of where the gospel was and what was happening in these mission fields in 1910, in the beginning of the 20th century. This project, the Atlas of Global Christianity, Todd Johnson had a hand in creating that. He's the director of the study of global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Boston today. And this document was purposely set at about 100 years distance after this missionary conference to try to take stock of what was happening around the world in Christianity. So some of the facts that I'm about to share with you come from that document. Here's what we're looking at. In 1500, over 90% of Christians lived on the European continent. Hence the name Christianity in Western culture. That's an appropriate name for much of the year. But things have changed. By the year 2000, roughly 2/3 of the world's Christians were from what had been mission fields a century earlier. Do you see the significance of that? 2/3 of the Christian population coming from former mission fields in the span of a century. What just happened? In 1910, and again that date is significant because of the Edinburgh Missionary Conference, in 1910 over 80% of all Christians lived in Europe and Northern America. By 2010, this has fallen to less than 40%, with the majority of Christians located in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Something very strange, well, gloriously unexpected has taken place in this last 100 years. And I identify as a Westerner. I am from the West. It's the only honest way to identify myself. I take comfort in the fact that this 40% here, by 2010, this number of Christians has fallen to 40%. I care about Christianity in the West. I hope it thrives in the future. I want Christianity to thrive. I am interested to know that this 40% does not reflect absolute decline in numbers, or decline in absolute numbers, I should say, but rather explosive growth outside of the West. So this is a number, this fall, if you will, of the numbers of down to 40% of world Christians in the West. That's something I can honestly rejoice over because it reflects explosive growth outside of the West, not a decline in terms of absolute numbers of Christians in the West. Good. Here are just a few more facts to sort of figure out what's happening here. The Christianity in Africa has grown from 10 million in 1900 to 360 million strong in 2000. And people in the know, like my friend Moses Awajaya, tell me that this number of 360 million is pretty conservative. He would like to see this number more at about 450 million, and this is what Moses does. He's earning his PhD in the study of global Christianity at Africa International University in Kenya. So it may be that this number is low, I don't know. But anyway, that represents a 3,600% growth of Christianity in 100 years. Wow. What just happened? What is that? How did that happen? Missiologists, historians, everybody, we're all just scrambling to try to figure out what the heck does this mean for us? What in the world just happened? It is kind of like a bomb just went off. David Livermore, who's writing from a missiological standpoint, writes, with the unprecedented growth of Christianity, 7,000 new church leaders are needed daily to care for the growing church. Yeah, you go figure out how to do that. According to the report of the World Evangelical Alliance in 1999, Christian leaders from every non-Western nation say that their most pressing need is for theological education. And I've done a telephone interview program for the last number of years. I've spoken to now 150 theologians from around the world, from 21 different countries in this telephone interview format, sort of trying to follow up on these stats. Is this what actually is happening on the outside? And again, it's been confirmed, yes, this is broadly what's happening in Christianity around the world today. So, I'm not going to object to the title, Christianity in Western Culture. That's fine. Up till about the year 1850, 1900, that title works pretty well. But something in the last 150 years broadly has changed the demographic makeup of the church hugely. And that won't be an accident. That won't have just magically started in the last 150 years. How did we get there? That's going to be part of the whole story, I'm convinced. And as I go through, I'm searching for ways to tie that story ever more robustly together. I do have a few more things that I'd like to say about world Christianity. I'm not going to start a new lesson at the end of our hour here, but give me another 15 minutes at least. There's some other things that I'd like to say about world Christianity, and then we'll try to close both with questions that have been coming in on Skype and perhaps a quiz. We'll take one of those as well. Just a little bit more on world Christianity. What is its shape in the current state? There have been a number of... The study of world Christianity, I should say, is very new. So although I tell you that I want my historiography to be one of studying world Christianity, and by the way, that's what my publisher is demanding of me as well as I revise your course textbook. So that's the process that I'm in. I'll let you know that. The study of world Christianity is very new. It's maybe only 10 or 15 years old to most of us. There have been specialists who have been working in what we now call world Christianity for a few more decades, but to most of us, to most church historians or missiologists, this is a relatively new phenomenon. In 1982, well, let me start here with this quote that I've got over here, if I can get the document camera. Lamin Sanneh is a name that you may not know yet, but I'd like you to learn that now. Lamin Sanneh, just as soon as I can get the document camera, would be swell. He's been working in world Christianity about as long as anybody has. He's one of the pioneers in the field. And he writes this. I wonder, this is in a 1995 article, this is about one of the earlier calls for a rewriting of church history. He writes, I wonder what the study of church history would look like if it had a global perspective. If it viewed world Christianity not with a sense of decline and uncertainty, but with a sense of expansion and promise. Indeed, might not the entire structure of theological education change if it began to respond to the realities of world Christianity? That I've taken as a clarion call. That's a goal of mine to figure out how to do church history in that context. But as I've already told you, we're feeling our way forward. How did we come to be aware of world Christianity? How is it that we've become aware of this reality? There are a few key sources that we can trace back. If you wish, the godfather of the study of world Christianity is named Andrew Walls. He's still active. I believe he lives in Kenya, and he was the doctor father, so we say. He was the PhD supervisor for the man that I showed you briefly a moment ago, for Moses Hawajaya. So he's still living and active and writing in topics of world Christianity. I've not been able to get his attention. Personally, I've not had a conversation with him, but he, I think, is in his early 90s and has been a pioneering figure in this field. He started out his career as a missionary to Kenya and began studying church history there in Kenya. The projects that excuse me, I've got his biography wrong, so hold on a moment. I do think he was a missionary in Kenya. I think I've got that much right, but what I'm about to tell you concerning the World Christian Encyclopedia is with somebody else. Excuse me. David Barrett is another name that I need you to know. David Barrett. Until the release of the Atlas of Global Christianity in 2009, David Barrett's World Christian Encyclopedia, published in 1982, was kind of our standard go-to text for understanding what was taking place in formerly known mission fields. David Barrett worked he came to Kenya in 1957 as an Anglican missionary, and he began researching religious demographics, first in Kenya, but then broadly throughout Africa, and produced eventually this World Christian Encyclopedia. And because of the surprisingness of the finds, because of the huge numbers of thriving churches in Africa, this book became more and more referred to, eventually becoming sort of a standard reference work. Good. Chase, how's your computer looking? Any luck? Great. Great. Do we have any questions?
None at this point.
Okay. Superb. What about a quiz, Chase? Oh, in 5 minutes? Great. All right. So I've got I'll do another lecture bit for 5 minutes. Well, here's another few books that you should know about. You should really know about Philip Jenkins' The Next Christendom. This was published in 2001. I had the opportunity of doing a telephone interview with Philip Jenkins. He was very gracious to give me that interview. And he told the story about how there comes the time of in the life of every manuscript when the author submits the manuscript to the publisher, and then that's the point of no return, and he can't make any further changes to the book. Well, for Philip Jenkins, the book that he wrote here, The Next Christendom, he submitted on September the 10th, 2001, and then, of course, 9/11 happened the next day, and this was very oddly the very last day that Philip Jenkins had the opportunity to write out his views on world Christianity before the next decade unfolded. But Jenkins does do a marvelous job of giving us a very readable account, very approachable account of this massive transition. The language that Philip Jenkins uses to describe this growth, this burgeoning phenomenon, world Christianity, he speaks of the motion from the global north, he'll say, to the global south. Is that terminology that you've heard before? Can I see a show of hands? How many of you heard? Okay, I'm surprised. Maybe 10 of you there. Philip Jenkins will describe this. There have been studies where you map the entire self-professing Christian population in the world on a globe and then place a dot at the center of that population mass, okay? So formerly, that dot representing a center, if you will, to Christianity would have anchored itself somewhere in the northern parts of the world. It would have been up, I'm not sure where, maybe somewhere around Rome. I don't know. And gradually, in the last decades, that dot, representative of global world Christian population, has been floating south. In the year 1980, it crossed the equator, and now is somewhere quite far south of the equator. Philip Jenkins writes about this shift in Christian demographics from the global north to the global south, and many who speak of global Christianity today have been using this language as well. John Mbiti, who did us the honor of actually speaking to our Global Christianity class last year, he observed, he's a very well-known African theologian, hails from Kenya. He writes, the centers of the church's universality are no longer in Geneva, Rome, Athens, Paris, London, New York, but Kinshasa, Buenos Aires, Addis Ababa, and Manila. These are city names that I can hardly pronounce, but that's where some of the largest Christian populations on earth are right now. Philip Jenkins writes this too, just to give us a snapshot, a visual snapshot in our mind of what is happening to Christianity around the world, how it's shifting, growing, developing, and we have to assume how God is working the next chapter of his story. Philip Jenkins writes this, if we want to visualize a, quote, typical contemporary Christian, we should think of a woman living in a village in Nigeria or a Brazilian favela. In parts of Asia, too, churches are growing rapidly in numbers and self-confidence. Whatever that means to you, it gives me an excitement as we study church history, trying to figure out really something of a mystery story. How did we get to this moment, and what just happened? Chase, am I jumping the gun? Okay. Great. I'll be very glad to take that question.
So one of the questions we got.
Great.
Should be on the screen any moment.
Superb.
Says, why should we consider Andrew Walls the godfather of world Christianity, and what did he do?
That's a really good question, and I didn't fully explain that, so thanks for that question. So he was a missiologist. He worked as a missionary in Kenya, I believe, for a number of years, and then he returned to Edinburgh and founded a center there. We have in the United States, in Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, the Center for the Study of Global Christianity. As I understand it, that center is very much modeled off of the pioneering work that Andrew Walls established at the University of Edinburgh back in the 1970s, I think. The center is now called the Center for the Study of World Christianity, although it began with a different name. So Andrew Walls, in founding this center and in his writing and publication, really shaped this early study of world Christianity, which was not really a discipline previously. We had missiology, we've had church history. He kind of brings the two together a little bit in this study of what he calls world Christianity. Thanks for that question.
One other one that didn't get up on the screen is essentially how do we keep up with the demand for leaders, whether it's through teaching or around the world globally, the need for preachers and pastors?
Good. I have no idea, but I think there's room in this garden for 1,000 flowers to blossom. You have an idea? Do it. It's pretty much my answer. I want to collaborate with people on how to try to figure that out. And if you have a good idea, tell me about it. But I do think that this is one of the most pressing issues in our place as Christians, where we are at the moment. I started on this journey of realizing this when I was a postdoctoral student in Germany, and I was studying in a German faculty, and realized that this German faculty had an amazing resources. Their library facilities were incredible. They had scholars there who could read Greek with an amazing capacity. They had tremendous intellectual resources, and the church in Germany is doing all right. But it's not growing nearly to the pace that we do see in some of these other countries. How do you get theological education from where it's required to where it's needed? I don't know, but if you have ideas, I'd love to talk to you. Class, you can dismiss yourselves whenever you wish. Would you thank the teaching assistants? It goes without saying that we couldn't run this without them. So thank you so much. If you have questions for me, I'll hang around for another moment or two. I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks a lot.